My name is Jayne Josem and I'm the Museum Director and CEO of the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, Australia. So thank you everyone for joining us on this Sunday, where we're around 4 weeks into lockdown. It's a surreal experience and a historical time in all our lives. Now please turn off your videos for a more seamless experience of the conversation today. And I recommend you put on speaker view, which is on the top right-hand side of your screen. I have muted you all. I want to acknowledge that the Jewish Holocaust Centre is on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. Some of you may be on different lands, so I extend this acknowledgement to the traditional owners of those lands too. We must always respect the history of our lands, especially where injustice has occurred. This is the first step towards healing and reconciliation of past with the world that we inhabit today. Sorry, my mum is trying to get through to me. Maybe she can't get on. This is a great link to our conversation this morning, Making Peace with the Past. And welcome to this special event, which is introducing you to author Esther Safran Foer, who's beaming in from the United States in conversation with Tali Lavi, who I will introduce shortly. Now, if you haven't already read her book titled I Want You to Know We're Still Here, I highly recommend it. The book is available through our friends at the Avenue bookstore. Now, I just wanted to give you a bit of backstory. The shidduch, or the matchmaking between the Jewish Holocaust Centre and Esther, was made by our former development manager, Michelle Mallet, who I say hello to. I hope she's tuning in right now. Michelle lived in Melbourne for a few years and is now living in Washington, DC, where she's Director of Development at the Capital Jewish Museum, where Esther is a proud board member. Hello to Michelle and anyone else from your museum tuning in from Washington. So they've been redeveloping their museum and are due to hold their groundbreaking ceremony in a few weeks. So mazel tov to you on this fantastic effort. We just handed over our site to the builders and partial demolition is underway. So we understand what you're going through right now. The Capital Jewish Museum, by the way, it explores the intersection of American Judaism and American democracy and serves as a secular space for storytelling, connection and dialogue across cultural communities for Washington, DC and the nation at large. So you can go to www.capitaljewishmuseum.org and check out what they're up to. I look forward to visiting one day, catching up with Michelle and perhaps hopefully meeting Esther in person. That would be delightful. We're grateful to have Tali Lavi conducting this conversation. There'll be opportunity for questions at the end. So if you please write your questions in the chat facility and we'll select some that perhaps haven't already been answered. Tali Lavi is a writer and critic whose work has been published in the Australian Book Review, the Monthly, the Sydney Review of Books, and Garden Among Fires, a lockdown anthology. Sounds interesting. She's the former co-program manager at the Melbourne Jewish Book Week. Tali's interviewed writers for Melbourne Jewish Book Week, Adelaide Writers Week, Melbourne Writers Festival, and the Sydney Jewish Writers Festival. She holds an MA in Creative Writing from RMIT University. So I'll now hand over to Tali to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's a great pleasure to be talking with Esther Safran Foer, who is joining us direct from Washington. Esther was, amongst other things in her working life, the CEO of Sixth and I, a centre for arts, ideas and religion. Her book, I Want You to Know We're Still Here, published this year, is a work which reverberates. The Australian edition subtitle is My Family, the Holocaust and My Search for Truth, whilst the American edition subtitle is a post-Holocaust memoir. It encompasses both of these things and more. In telling the story, Esther addresses the limits of encapsulating the Shoah and also the necessity of talking about it. For some of us, the Shoah has its fragments lodged deep in our psyche, our very bodies, whether it be in a physical sense for survivors or the epigenetic experience of those of second and third generation. Esther is a skilled archaeologist of memory. Each strata uncovered is dense with story, from historical accounts to shards of the vanished world and people, to stories of the shtetl of Drachenrod that border on the mythic. I have found reading this book to be a deeply embodied experience. No doubt this is something to do with epigenetics. In speaking into the silence of her family, she has spoken into the silence of mine and many others. I am third generation. Both of my grandparents on my mother's side were survivors. A significant part of the haunting that occurred in my family and arguably continues to do so emerges out of the murder of my grandparents' daughter, my mother's sister Esther Mindel, who was not yet 3 years of age, when she was taken to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. For those who have read the book, this parallel will resonate. For others, it will become more clear as we go along. Before we begin our conversation, I'd just like to mention to those readers that both Esther and I have agreed not to speak directly of two matters that lie at its heart. The reasoning behind this is to pay respect to the journey of the book. I do urge all who have not yet done so to read it. You will find that experience profoundly affecting and illuminative. I'd now love to welcome Esther. Hi, Esther.
Hi, thank you. I am so delighted to be here. I wish I were there in person. I have visited Melbourne with my husband. My husband has a family in Melbourne that we adore. And the plan was that I would be talking to you in person, but alas, here I am and delighted to visit with you on Zoom.
Well, let's just hope that one day it is in fact in person. That would be wonderful.
I'm talking about it.
Esther, I wonder if we could maybe get a sense of the book by you doing a reading from, as I understand, the beginning of it.
Okay, wonderful. What I'm going to do is read right from the first chapter. And I'm not going to read everything. I've taken some pieces out, but it'll give you a sense of the story and the journey that I was on. My birth certificate says that I was born on September 8th, 1946 in Ziegenheim, Germany. It's the wrong date, the wrong city, the wrong country. It would take me years to understand why my father created this fabrication, why each year my mother would come into my room on March 17th, give me a kiss, and whisper, "Happy birthday." Piecing together the fragments of my family's story has been a lifelong pursuit. I'm the offspring of Holocaust survivors, which by definition means there's a tragic and complicated history. My childhood was filled with silences that were punctuated by occasional shocking disclosures. I understood there was a lot that I didn't know besides the secret of my invented birthday. My parents were reluctant to speak of the past, and I learned to maneuver around difficult subjects. When I was in my early 40s, preparing to give a talk at a local synagogue, I decided it might be a good opportunity to fill in a few gaps of our family story. I sat down with my mother in the pink kitchen of her 1950s suburban tract house on a street where most of the other homes were occupied by families of Holocaust survivors. Sitting at her faux marble laminate kitchen table, I could see the carefully clipped coupons sorted into neat piles by the refrigerator, ready for the next shopping trip. In the cabinet below, there was enough flour and cereal, all of it purchased on sale, to withstand a major catastrophe, something I now appreciate. I started with a few questions about my father and his experience during the war. He'd been an enigma, a mercurial figure that all conversation danced around, even in my own head. My mother took a sip of the instant coffee that she loved and casually mentioned that my father had been in a ghetto with his wife and daughter. He'd been on a work detail when they were murdered by the Nazis. Absolutely stunned, I blurted out, "He had a wife and daughter? Why haven't you ever told me this before? How can you be telling me this now?" I'd grown up surrounded by ghosts, haunted by relatives who were rarely talked about, and by stories that no one would share. And now there was a new ghost I hadn't even known about, my own sister. How do you remember someone who has left no trace? The search took me to places that allowed me to more deeply understand the Holocaust and how it continued to reverberate long past the liberation and into future generations. It was ultimately a search that took me to places inside myself that scared me. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Esther. I think that encapsulates so much of the book in terms of, we'll be talking later about silences, about shocking disclosures, about ghosts. But I wonder maybe if you can start at the beginning of your story, which of course is not the beginning really of the story, and that is, where were you born?
So, unlike what my birth certificate says, I was born in Lodz, Poland. My parents, like lots of refugees who had survived, who had gone east to survive or were in hiding, were making their way west to try to figure out how to get out of the graveyard of Europe. My parents arrived in Lodz sometime in 1945, were married there on May 1st, 1945, which was really interesting. I have the ketubah, and it's interesting because they were married on Lag BaOmer. And when I realized that, I thought, how many Jewish couples who had lost everything were waiting to get married on this day, on Lag BaOmer, this day in between a period of mourning where marriages were allowed. I was born March of 46 in Lodz. My parents had a business there, but they knew that Lodz was only a temporary stopping point. Like most Jews who had suffered the Holocaust, they wanted out of Europe. There was no place to go home to. They couldn't go back to their shtetls where everyone had been murdered and everything had been taken. And then when I was 6 months old, somewhere around 6 months old, I don't know precisely, this is a little vague, we smuggled out of Poland just as the Iron Curtain was descending. We smuggled out in a sort of a military vehicle with a false bottom, where my mother tells me she had to put rags in my mouth in order to make sure that I didn't make any noise on the most critical parts of the trip. We smuggled into Germany. On our way west, we ended up spending 2.5 years there in DP camps, displaced persons camps. There were 250 to 300,000 Jewish refugees who had nowhere to go, who ended up in these camps. These camps, this is a period of history that isn't talked about very much. Everybody assumes the war was over, the Jews went to Palestine or Australia or the United States, and everybody lived happily ever after. In fact, during this period, they had nowhere to go. Palestine wasn't open, and no place in the world wanted these Jewish refugees. The Allied troops were hoping that they would just go back to their homeland, but that wasn't an option. There was nothing to go back to. And so the next years, for us, only 2.5, for some people longer, were spent in these displaced persons camps, some of which were in terrible conditions. Some of them existed in former concentration camps, if you can imagine that. Ours, the one we were in the longest, was a former POW camp with no heat, no facilities, no kitchens, former Army barracks. When I asked my mother what my crib was like, she said, crib? She said, we had army cots. But yet Jews did what they could to rebuild their lives in this place and to get ready for the next step. But it is a forgotten, difficult years for Jewish refugees.
I did find it fascinating, that part, particularly not particularly in terms of the book, but because I hadn't heard these narratives about the DP camps. And there's so much of the history there that I won't go into now, but it was so interesting. And one of the other things that I found interesting is that even though conditions were really tough in those camps, there was a sense of maybe idealism. They were going towards something, and there was a camaraderie that for some of them they would never have again. In a way, they're surrounded by people who had shared their experience.
That's absolutely right. Here they were with other refugees. When I looked at the pictures, I had always, you know, because I had these pictures of a smiling little 2-year-old toddler. I had a little white fur rabbit coat. I had a tricycle. So I assumed this was a happy period. And it was for me. I had 2 adoring parents. I had a community, no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents, no cousins, but a community of survivors that were pulling together, trying to build life. The DP camps had the highest birth rate of any place in the world at that time. And you can understand why. People were trying to build and celebrate life. When I looked at those pictures, there are pictures, you know, when I look beyond my smiling face and my 2 adoring parents, I see barbed wire. I see these barracks that look like they're, you know, barely standing up. I see watchtowers. And I didn't really focus on that until I was writing the book. I was focused on being a loved baby with picnics and birthday parties. And what's interesting, my parents and most of the other people were beautifully dressed. They were aspiring to a new life. And it wasn't the way they looked in the shtetls, but they wanted to move forward. And it was a period of dreaming and trying to figure out where in the world to go when nobody wanted us.
Esther, at what point in your life do you realize that part of your role is to be a source of joy to your parents?
Oh, I think I knew that instinctively from the beginning, and probably so did all of those other toddlers I played with in the DP camp. Here I was born to this family that had nothing. I was named for 2 murdered grandmothers. But, you know, how could you do anything but see your role as bringing joy to these people who had suffered so much? Now, of course, in the beginning it was unconscious, and then later I really understood what my role was. And it's a little bit difficult and a little bit of a burden.
Yes, because as you say, there's this unconscious conflict going on. There is this sense that you need to provide joy. And yet within your naming itself, there's a commemoration of not just your grandmother's lives, but their deaths as well, I think.
And the deaths of my aunts and my cousins and my entire extended family. I didn't realize until we came to the United States and I, you know, entered school that people had grandparents and they had cousins. And one of my son's jokes that I am so attached to family. And he jokes that he said, I used to take them as little kids to Brazil to be with third cousins. That's what I had. And those relationships were important to me.
Mm. There is a really potent thread through your book, which is the significance of names, both the seeking of them and the granting of them, the reciting of them. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Well, it's very interesting because my original editors read the book and they go like, there are pages where you're just listing names and it's hard to relate to who these people were. But that was very important to me. These are my relatives who are not recorded anywhere. They are in mass graves. And this was my opportunity to put their names in a place where it will be read. Of course, it'll be read in Yad Vashem, where we did put their names. But in this book, which is about tragedy, but also joy, the joy of a family that did survive, that is thriving. So putting those names down was so important. And then, of course, when I had children, and I've been lucky enough to have 3 amazing sons, the naming of those sons, honoring the memory of my family. And now my grandchildren, and much to my amazement, my own sons have chosen, without pressure from me, because I'm a good mother and I wouldn't do that, they've chosen to have the names live on in their children, and it's very precious.
As you say, there is a joyful aspect to your nature. You write that people know you as smiling. We do have this sense of a person who is of good nature, who's sympathetic, who's leading us through this experience. And you note a resistance to being reduced by your parents' pasts and conforming to expectations. You write, I wanted to embrace life, not to scrape by, not to live in the shadows. So the shadows, what did they consist of?
You know, it's a lot of this I didn't really understand until I had the opportunity to write this book. This book is 2 things. It's about my search and what I found, and it's about my family's life today. But it also gave me the opportunity to look inside myself and to see what the impact of these stories is for me. So these ghosts, you know, I happen to live a very nice life. I've been very lucky. And sometimes I will sit with a grandchild, a beautiful new grandchild who's such a precious gift, and I'll hear them crying uncontrollably. And I'll think, oh my God, if we were in the ghetto, what would we do? And then I snap back and I look at this gorgeous child and I like, here we are, Washington, D.C., you know, a very lucky family that's living a wonderful life. But I'll have those moments. Or when I'm baking something, I love making challah. Well, I know that my grandmother made challah. And I think about, oh my God, you know, I've got my thermometer sticking in to make sure the temperature is just right in the middle. My grandmother did this in a wood stove, but she did it every Friday night. And she would make sure that one of her daughters ran challah over to her sister and her sister's family. So that they're kind of with me all the time. But the writing of the book, I was able to put them in a better place and to understand where they were and where I am.
Mm. Philosopher Slavoj Žižek has written, traumas we are not ready or able to remember haunt us all the more forcefully. Do you think this was true of your upbringing?
This was absolutely true. And I think the fact that I was able to remember, that I was able to, I've unfortunately or fortunately never been through therapy, but which I understand is a wonderful thing. But the writing of this book was able to take those traumas out of the past, and my opportunity to put them in a place where I could deal with them in a very positive way. And anybody who is in this situation, and I bet a lot of your audience is, I urge them to try it, to try writing their story. It doesn't have to be a book. It can be a couple of pages, but it's a wonderful, liberating experience. And it's a profound gift to your family.
It is. And further to that, well, yours essentially is so interesting because it might have started out that way, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but it's become a gift to so many of us whose experiences mirror yours. One of the really interesting things about you that is encapsulated in the book is that you are preoccupied by and a keeper of memory. Can you share with us your penchant for glass jars and Ziploc bags?
I would love to. I mean, forever I have been, you know, what do you bring back from trips? And I decided I sort of had enough trinkets and tchotchkes, and I started thinking, well, I would bring back dirt from places that I had been. And this was very profound when I visited the mass graves in Ukraine. There isn't a lot to bring back from Ukraine. So I would bring back dirt, and I would put them in these jars, and they're labeled, you probably can't see on the top, they're from the mass graves where my family's buried. I had to take the word mass grave off because one of my sons says, you know, your grandchildren are going to see this and it's going to be weird for them to look at dirt from mass graves. But I you know, here are the leaves from the pear tree in the village my father lived in. And it was the only thing that when I went to the village, people told me that was still alive. The houses had been burned, but if you can imagine, there was a pear tree still giving pears with leaves that probably my father and his family ate from. And it was in the backyard of their house. So here I am in this village tearing leaves off the pear tree, putting them in a Ziploc bag to bring with me. And then I brought one more jar to show. This is from Uluru, and where my husband and I visited several years ago. So there are very positive, beautiful memories in addition to these. And they all sit on the mantle and they look like an art installation. You don't know what they are. And my grandchildren have now, our youngest grandson, he's now 7, he went to Greece. And he comes back with a bag of dirt from Greece that he feels might be a good addition to my collection, and it is.
I love that. I think this fascination also plays out in your wonderful family Pesach Seders, which is fitting really, given that Pesach is about embodied memory. We're meant to relive the experience of leaving servitude. Can you talk to us a little bit about these?
Yes, well, we love Passover. And I think that, Tali, what you just said about memory, Jews are a people of memory. When you read the Torah, when you read the 5 books of Moses, it's about memories. It's not about what happened in what century. It's about the individual stories. And I think that's what's so important about preserving the stories like mine, like so many of you others have, of what happened in the Holocaust. It's not a number, it's not about 6 million, it's not about 1.5 million children. It's about real people and what happened to them, and it allows you to visualize that. So Passover in our house is, it's just an extravaganza. And every year there's a new idea that one year we built a tent inside the house. We draped fabric that I bought that looked like stars in the sky around the room, so we felt like we were in a tent. One year, not too long before my mother died, her great-grandchildren interviewed her, and at the Seder talked about our own family's escape, our own family's journey to freedom. And it's something they'll always remember. A couple of years ago, now we have younger grandchildren, so rather than sit around the table, I bought pillows. I don't even know how many, but enough to fill a room. And we sat on these exotic pillows as though we were in the desert telling the story. And then if one of the grandchildren has some idea, we link into it. Like one of our grandsons was into the Civil War. Okay, well, that's, you know, a story of freedom. And they dressed up like characters in the Civil War, but we also talked about what the soldiers did, the Jewish soldiers from the North and the South, and how they celebrated Pesach, which they did in the middle of a war. And these are all lessons and memories.
And I understand that it would be highly inappropriate of me to try to elicit an invitation to a future Seder of yours. But it feels like you have passed on this interest to your sons. They have taken on this interest in memory, each in their really distinctive way.
Yes, absolutely. Well, our middle son, Jonathan, wrote Everything is Illuminated, which was the fictionalized version of the history of the shtetl we came from. Our oldest son, Frank, is a historian and came with me to Ukraine. Our youngest son, this is the big unexpected surprise, is a journalist and an entrepreneur, and went to the US Memory Championship for a publication and covered it. And he met with the winners and they said, oh, you know, he said, well, you guys must have great memories. They said, no, it's about tricks. It's about training your mind to remember these things. And they said, anybody can do it. And he said, well, could I do it? And they said, sure. And so he spent, I don't know, 6 months a year training to enter the US Memory Championship. And unbelievably, he won. He did not expect to win. The guy who was expected to win messed up on something. And then he represented the United States in the international memory competition, which he did not win. But memory, and he wrote a book called Moonwalking with Einstein, A Journey Through Memory and the Mind. So yeah, it permeates through our family. And I'm now watching it in our grandchildren. My oldest granddaughter would sit with me in my home office and she'd look at the boxes of pictures and said to me one day, Grandma, how am I going to know who these people are? And I realized that I have to do this for her. And she's now the self-described family historian. So I passed it on.
I'd like to talk about the role of silence in your childhood. As you read out, you say, my childhood was filled with silences that were punctuated by occasional shocking disclosures. I feel that there are two narratives played out between first and second generation in your book. There's your mother Ethel's admonitions of Gnuk, enough, which you counter with a silent, it's not enough.
Right. It's not enough, but how do you maneuver around that silence when you don't want to hurt your parents? And, you know, as I was born the child that was supposed to bring joy, I certainly could not inflict the pain of asking them the details of their stories. And it's interesting because this is something that one of my sons says, I use child labor. But when one of our sons was graduating from high school, he had to do a senior project and we talked about what it could be. I said, interview your grandmother. And she was able to tell him things she could never tell me, because these conversations with me are about inflicting pain on each other. But with him, it was her immortality. This was her grandchild who wanted to know about her. And then, of course, Jonathan took this trip to Ukraine, and he followed the journey in a different way. So each of our sons has done that. Our youngest son, both of his children are named for Holocaust victims. So they played an important role, and they were able to bridge the Gnugshun to find out more. And they to them, their grandmother's a superhero. And I will tell you a funny story since we're here tonight. Tomorrow, my mother died a little over a year ago, COVID and everything else. We haven't had an unveiling. So I decided that tomorrow we're going to host a Zoom 100th birthday, 100th celebration. She would be 100 years old this year. And instead of going to the cemetery, we're all going to get together on Zoom and celebrate who she was. And the kids have been phenomenal. One of them is creating a Bubby trivia. I mean, we'll all share memories, but there'll be the humor that's part of our life. And I love that combination. That's what we are.
I love that too. For your mother also, there's a precedent for the cost of talking. What happens to Sura's brother-in-law when she goes back to Kolki?
Oh my goodness. So she was in Europe all the way into Asia, Russia, Asia, Kazakhstan. And then as she and the woman that she was hiding with, found out that the villages, the shtetls in what is now Western Ukraine were being liberated, they decided they had to go back. And my mother and her friend Sora, my mother kept saying, we've got to save some rice so that we can have some money so that we can buy new dresses when we go back because we're going to see our family. Well, of course, there was nothing to go back to. She went back to the shtetl with her friend. Not only nothing, she saw somebody walking across the road in her sister's dress. And someone said, you've got to leave. You can't stay here. We don't know what'll happen to you. But a friend of the family's, somebody not Jewish, took them into their house and wanted to give them something to eat. Here were these two women who, were eating rice and potatoes, stealing potatoes so they could eat. And apparently he set up a lovely, I don't know what, a dinner for them. And my mother said, but I couldn't eat. And we said, well, why not? You were hungry. And then we said, he was serving you pork? And she said, yes. And if I'm losing the exact, she says, if nothing matters, there's nothing to save. And even at this point, she looked at what mattered in her life, in her background, kept her from eating that pork. And it's such a beautiful lesson for our family. I'm not advocating kashrut, but when you hold on to things that matter, you hold on to a lot more than just your life.
That really echoed what Viktor Frankl writes about how to find meaning in life and the importance of finding meaning, whatever that meaning might be. And that story, it just embodies it so deeply, I think. You also write about the imposed silence on survivors of new countries who didn't want to hear, or communities they came to who were, as you say, afraid to ask or afraid to hear, or old countries where it was dangerous to talk. The cost of this are, as you say, an internalization of the horror of the Holocaust. Would you say this is your father's experience?
Exactly. I mean, we came to the United States in the early 1950s, 1949. It was a time when people didn't talk about anything, but they certainly didn't want to talk. The message, as I heard it from my mother, was, it was terrible, but you've got to forget about it and move on. And of course, how do you move on from having lost everything and watched your family die and have nothing left? In their case, they had me, but they came to a country where they couldn't speak the language, where they had to start all over again, but without the support network of a family, without knowing that their family were in the graveyards of Europe. And so I don't know if you want me to continue that part of the story, but my father suffered terribly for that, and sadly died an unfortunate death.
One of the ideas that particularly resonated for me throughout the book, and which I'm really fascinated by, is the notions of the presence of absence. The thing that exists even when we don't know what that absence is. So it's not until, as you read in your introduction, some of us who might have come a bit later might have missed it. And I'd like to say at this point that this is going to be recorded as well. So if you would have missed any part of this interview, you can go back and look at it. But it was not until your 40s that you discovered that your father had a wife and child before the war. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that that absence didn't pervade your life, that your sister's ghost didn't haunt it.
Right. I mean, we were a sister, if you can imagine, a half-sister, a sister who was killed. And if it didn't haunt me until I learned about it, it certainly haunted my father. There were lots of absences. Whether you go to whether you go to the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and you watch a family together, and we don't have it. Whether you have a family celebration and there's nobody there to stand up with you. And I think it's one of the reasons, well, for me, we have 3 sons, we have 6 grandchildren, and I feel so the blessing of this family, and the fact that we're still here.
Mm. And I want to talk really quickly about such a big topic. I wish we had hours. About ambiguous loss. So Dr. Pauline Boss was a pioneer in the interdisciplinary study of family stress. And in the 1970s, she coined a term, ambiguous loss. There's a wonderful interview with her on Krista Tippett's On Being, if you're interested. But with ambiguous loss, there's no promise of resolution. She speaks of it as applying to cases where there is a physical presence and a psychological absence, or a physical absence and a psychological presence. And there is so much ambiguous loss in your childhood in the absence of facts, names, bodies, causes of death, photos, dates. We can go on. And I'm thinking, even when your parents restart their lives twice over, I mean, Lodge wasn't really a new beginning, but it was a new chapter. And you and your parents live in an apartment in Lodge that was once owned by murdered Jews. And then again, when you get to the United States, here you are sponsored by a wonderful family of yours, and they're dealing with their own loss.
Absolutely true. And when I look at pictures of that apartment in Lodge, I look at it and it's got paintings on the wall, and it's got covers on the tablecloth, and actually quite beautiful furniture. And I realize it's there, we're moving into it, but it was lived in by another Jewish family, and who probably didn't survive. And then the other thing that you mentioned, we came here, we came in August of 49. My mother had 2 aunts we wanted to actually go to Brazil, where my mother has a large family, all those third cousins that I take my children to come and see. And, but she had 2 aunts in America. We couldn't get into Brazil. Her uncle promised everything. We wouldn't be a burden to the state. We'd have a place to live. But like so much of the world, Brazil was anti-Semitic and was limiting the number of Jews that could come in. And we were a family of 3. So we came to the United States, and I don't think we knew what we were really coming to. My mother had 2 aunts, 2 uncles, their husbands, first cousins. And we got here, and we learned that we came to this family that was suffering its own tremendous tragedy. My mother's first cousin, there was only 1 child in the next generation who would have been my second cousin. His name was Mark, and Mark was the only child of that generation in this American family. And he died just a few months before we came in the course of a routine tonsillectomy. And so I don't even know how they dealt with us, how, you know, I was playing in the rooms that Mark had probably played in. He was 6 months older than I was if he had lived. And right now, I'm the keeper of Mark's memory, in addition to the keeper of the memory of all of my murdered relatives in Ukraine. I have stacks of pictures of Mark because there is no one else to keep that memory alive.
I like to go to the search itself. In some ways, this part of the book reminded me a bit of Daniel Mendelssohn's extraordinary book, The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, where he's intent on resuscitating, in a way, 6 members of his family. So I wonder, when you begin this, what are you hoping for?
Oh, I think I was hoping for, I didn't know what I was hoping for. And in fact, a dear friend of ours who actually is also a writer took me to lunch before the trip and was trying to make sure that I was managing my expectations. He'd gone to Ukraine. His his, I guess, ancestors like mine, his grandparents were murdered there. And you know, we had this lovely lunch, and he says, you know, it was enough to walk the streets and breathe the air. And that's probably what you're going to find. So he was trying to prepare me. I didn't know what I would find. I really didn't expect to find that much, but I had reached the point where I knew that I had to take the trip myself. Jonathan had taken it. He didn't find anything. Fortunately, he wrote this amazing novel. People started to give me pieces of information that started to fit together because of his book, because they would call me and they would say, what he wrote in his book isn't true. And I said, of course it wasn't true. It's a novel. But they insisted on telling me, you know, that it wasn't true, but also telling me some of the truths. And I was able to piece them together, and I knew that I had to go myself, that I would always regret that I hadn't done it. And I didn't know what I'd find, but I have to say that in every shtetl I went to, I found something. I found people who still had stories about my family, who knew where they had lived, and this is without my prompting them. And did I find the whole truth? I'm sure I didn't, but I found enough of the truth to give me peace. So I'm so grateful that I did it.
And you take on the role of detective with quite some brio, Esther.
Yeah, I think it's a role I enjoy. My first job was a reporter and researcher for a congressional publication in Washington. And I found I loved putting pieces together and helping put pieces of a story together, that I was kind of a natural detective. And this really, I didn't even realize I was being a detective, but I was. And as I traveled the world, and I was lucky enough to do that, I would meet with people. My mother would suggest people that I could meet with in Brazil or in Israel, who somehow knew stories about our family, who had been my father's partners in lodge. And everybody would give me these pieces, and it was starting to make sense as a whole. And then I hired a young woman in Ukraine, who I recently talked to on a Zoom talk, by the way. And she, I interviewed a number of different people who are like fixers, who will go and find these shuttles, who do research. And she was just passionate about the story. She wasn't a professional like some of the other people I talked to, but she was passionate. And she laid groundwork. She advanced the trip. She went from shtetl to shtetl to meet people who might have something, find the oldest people in the village. And ultimately, she sent me some pictures from a tiny little village where I had thought my father and his family had lived, and the ghetto where they were murdered. And she met with people there, and she thought she had found the family that had hidden my father, which to me seemed surreal. I really didn't expect to find that. But she sent me, I had one little tiny picture that I could look at. She sent me pictures of the family that had been in the house. And what do you do with these pictures, and how do you really understand it? And, you know, seemed impossible to me. So in the process of being a detective, I hired an FBI forensic photography expert, which was a wonderful part of the adventure. And at the end of our session, he said, I can't tell you it's them, but I can't tell you it's not. And he gave me clues of what to look for when I'm in Ukraine. And one of the most important clues was, look at the clothes people are wearing. It's not the United States or Australia where you have all these different outfits to put on. If they're having their pictures taken, it's probably in the same clothing. And that turned out to be, it was the key piece of information.
I have this sense when I was reading it, and then again when I'm reflecting on the book, of how time is of the essence. So there's kind of the less weighted notion that if you had started it previously the search, you might not have had access to certain archives. But then there is the really heavy idea that it's probable you wouldn't have reached the same points as you did if you had begun it later. I'm thinking here of Anna the Old Woman. I'm thinking of Shmuel Potash on your visit to Trachenbrod. And I wonder if maybe you can talk just really briefly about Shmuel, because he is wonderful.
He is wonderful. I have to say that those two people are now deceased, sadly. Shmuel Potash was his father had the milk farm, I guess, I don't know what you call it, in Trachenbrod. Now, you have to understand, we were all going to Trachenbrod, a place that has now had a novel written about it, my book, there are other books, a major motion picture. There's nothing there. It is totally flat. We had to use sort of wagons, horse-driven wagons that were like going on a hayride to get there. And there was this wonderful man, Shmuel Potash, who was in his 90s. And because he delivered the milk, he was able to go through this field where nothing is standing and say, you know, this person lived here and this person lived there, and he knew everybody's nickname. It was like a human GPS system. And we were all sitting there amazed. And somebody would say, well, I think my family lived there. He said, no, they were over here. The trip with those former Trachenbroders, there were two parts to our trip. We linked onto this trip with these Israeli Trachenbroders, and that became then we had our own portion of the trip where we went to these shtetls that my mother and my father had lived in. It was phenomenal, and I thought, well, wow, there's all this humor in here. I mean, the Israelis we felt like the IDF had descended on Ukraine and they were there to save us. And there is tremendous humor in the time we spent with them, but that was life and that was the beauty of the trip. And there were other characters, amazing characters. Shmuel Potash brought all of his grandchildren. He since died, so, you know, it was the right thing to do. He brought all of them so they could see where their family came from. And he even they knew that these markers that were on the graves, I guess metal, maybe copper, I don't know what, had been stolen because they were melted down, they had value. And they knew that. So the Israelis brought big marble slabs to put in their place. And they brought a huge Israeli flag. So we're going through this Ukrainian deserted space, and they've got the Israeli flag flying in the wind. And actually, it turns out that the wagon that Frank, or my son, and I were in, there was a young Ukrainian girl who probably realized this might happen, and she unfurled this big Ukrainian flag. And Frank and I were absolutely horrified. I mean, what if my mother saw these pictures and we were in a Ukrainian wagon? The whole trip was a phenomenal experience. And it was so wonderful to be with these incredible people, some of whom had survived it and were able to tell us the stories firsthand in this place where nothing exists. I mean, nothing. Every house was burned, nothing.
I'm just wondering whether we have any questions. I've got some more, of course, but I'm just looking in the chat and it doesn't look, I think people are being very generous to me and giving me more time to ask my own questions. So I'm going to continue. And I wondered, it seems like such a broad question, but how has the search and the writing of the search informed upon your thinking?
In so many ways. I think I said earlier, I didn't realize how profound it would be. And my mother spent the last 3 years of her life living with us. And I found my book was due February 2019. And we knew she was almost 99 years old. So I knew I had to be ready with the book. I wanted to meet my deadline. She died in December December 18th, 2018. And between the time that she died and the time that I had to submit my manuscript, which was a month and a half, I found that I was able to say things I couldn't say while she was alive. That the story didn't change. I changed because of the search and because I could open up. I mean, when she would say, enough, we're not talking about this, there were things that I could suddenly open up about once she had died. I could kind of let emotions go in a way that I couldn't while she was laying upstairs in our house, which amazed me. But I think the book became more powerful during that period when I could really open up.
And do you think that it is informed further upon your children and grandchildren? There's one really strong scene where you're with your son Frank, and he says something about it's given him a new understanding of you. And I wondered if it's become wider than that once your kids kind of read the book or were reading it along the way.
There are a couple of stories there. So Frank was a journalist. He was a magazine editor. And I asked him why he came with me. Was he doing it as a journalist and as a historian? And he said, no, I was doing it as a son to support my mother. And my husband had always said if one of the kids wouldn't come with me, he would come, but it was really their story. And I've had this amazing opportunity. I've been lucky enough to do these Zoom talks all over the world, and certainly all over the United States. And I did my first Zoom conversation with Frank. And it was, we were able, beforehand, I said, so what are we going to talk about? And he said, I'm not going to tell you. It's got to be spontaneous. And the emotions that we were both able to let go of. And then I did a second one with Jonathan for the Jewish Heritage Museum in New York, which actually had over 1,000 people who registered for it. And he and I talked about the importance of talking and how silence can inhibit so much in a family. And so I think as a family, because of the writing of this book, I mean, we had these conversations in front of the world, but I think we're all much more open, whether it's about the Holocaust or other things in our family, because we've opened up about this.
There are a couple of questions. You're not being quite as generous as I thought. No. So Estelle asks, did you feel any anti-Semitism when you went to Ukraine? And how do you feel about the surge in anti-Semitism now?
So, no, I didn't feel any anti-Semitism, but, you know, the people I met with, first of all, I was paying a driver, I was paying my translator. You know, I guess one of the things I learned is how much they also suffered. I mean, certainly they didn't suffer the way the Jews suffered, but there was, I saw the destruction in these villages. Early, the first night we were having dinner with our translator, our fixer, and I laid the question out there. I said, you know, Jews feel uncomfortable about being in Ukraine and about anti-Semitism. Frank was sort of horrified. He felt like I'd just thrown a grenade into the middle of this conversation. And she told me that they know very little about what happened. They know what happened to Ukrainians. They don't know what happened to the Jews. And she said, the word they kept using is, we don't know about the problem. Mm. So did I feel I wasn't really interacting with ordinary people. I was going into these villages talking to people who really wanted to help me. I mean, here we were, a couple of Americans going into the middle of nowhere. We were a curiosity, and people would follow us around. You know, I have to say, as I went into the forest to see these mass graves, I felt the world was descending around me, as it must have descended on my grandmother's. And you sort of think, what if we get stuck here? But, you know, we didn't live normal lives there. We were tourists and searchers. And so I don't know what the anti-Semitism, what the situation is. I was on the phone actually this week with a bunch of young Jews in Lvov who are rebuilding the synagogue, one of the synagogues there, and trying to rebuild Jewish lives. Although there aren't many Jews left. One of the things I've enjoyed so much about these Zoom talks, first of all, meeting people like you, Tali, and your profound questions, where you help me peel off the layers of my story, but also I've connected to Jews around the world. I've done Zoom talks in Warsaw where the book hasn't been released. I did a Zoom talk in Lvov, connecting with young Jews who are trying to figure out their place in these countries where we used to live, and trying to build Jewish lives.
I think that countering the narrative of the horror is that there's a great thread of humanity in this book. You have a sense of fellowship and generosity. I'm thinking here of Sura and your mother, how they survived the war together. David Juvniruk and his family, just, I have no words. The fellowship of the survivors in Lodge and the DP camp camaraderie, you know, your family who sponsors you to the US, you all keeping of Mark and his family's memory. Anna, the teacher, Anna, the old woman, the Trachan brothers, you know, I can go on. So as you say, there is both joy amongst the horror or it's life amongst the horror, and which brings me to, actually, I'd love you to speak about your planting of the Shana Tova cards, which I feel is like you're planting trees of hope. I know that's not really what you're doing, but that's...
Well, so when we took this trip, and I had mentioned earlier that I met with this writer who had taken the trip, and he told me that when he was in Ukraine, he had written a book, a Jewish book actually, and he decided to leave it in the village, in the shtetl. And his driver said, why? It's just going to be blown away. And he said, he told me he wanted to leave something of himself there. And I thought, wow, that's really great. I want to leave something of myself and of my family. And every year we do the Shana Tova card, and it's a very big deal to us. We try to get the whole family together. I don't know what it's going to look like this year with masks, but, and you know, we take such pride in, you know, we have 13 or 14 people in our card, and I thought, this is what I'm going to leave. Now, who am I leaving it for? But Frank and I borrowed forks from the hotel, and at every mass grave, we dug a hole. It was almost like going to the Wailing Wall and putting a prayer in. We dug a hole and we buried this picture of our family. And in my mind, it was the most literal translation of the idea of, I want you to know we're still here. It was standing at the graves of my ancestors and saying, you don't know it. I'm sure they thought their whole family had been wiped out, but we're still here.
Indeed. Now that there's one question I just want to address, it's really quick. It's, what is the title of the book about absent memory, and who is the author? Well, the book is, I think you're talking about Ambiguous Loss, and that was by Pauline Boss. And the name, it was actually a podcast by Krista Tippett on Being. So that's, I'm just looking if there are any other questions before I go to the last one, because I really loved the story of Mi Pauline and the mezuzot, and I wonder if you could tell us about it.
Yes, so in the midst of this, I can't even remember whether it was before or after, it must have been after my trip. I learned about, I've been to Warsaw. I was a guest of the Polish government in Warsaw, and I learned about this company creating Judaica, modern Judaica, the first company doing this in Warsaw. And these are two young artists, and they came up with the idea of creating these mezuzot, to go. They would see the holes in the doors, and you see them everywhere. In Lvov, every door has this little hole, and you can see that it was a mezuzah. And they offered to go, if you give them an address, to find the address and to take an imprint of that hole and filling the hole, the absence. And somebody asked them to go to Trochenbrot. It surely wasn't me. And they said, but there's nothing there. What are we going to send you that can become a mezuzah? And they took imprints from what they thought was the oldest tree standing. They took imprints of the inside of the trunk that was kind of hollowed out, and also of some of the leaves that were still growing. And they created the most beautiful mezuzot. And I am their best customer in the world, I think, because I've given them to all of my children. I've given them to other Trochenbrothers. And in fact, if you go on Facebook right now, I met them in Warsaw. I told them about the book. They wanted copies. And I said, happy to send you copies. And they said, oh, but it's too expensive for us to have them shipped. I said, I'll ship them. And like yesterday, they posted something on Facebook holding up my book and how excited they were. And that's part of this global connection of a Jewish world that has been so powerful as we look at the past to see what the future might hold for us. So if anybody's interested in mezuzah, it's Mi Pauline, and they've already gotten some orders because of my book, they said. So that's really exciting.
Well, I have it open on my browser as we speak. So, and I'd just like to say, Esther, that the comments coming in are just to say thank you so much from everyone, and they say that so many people are relating to so many parts. So I think you must hear this everywhere that you go.
I love that I can inspire other people, that I can maybe open them up to tell their stories. It's one of the wonderful things about being able to do this.
Mm. Esther, what you do in I Want You to Know We're Still Here is akin to what those two artists of Mi Pauline are doing. It's as if you have constructed a beautiful web which contains, I'm thinking of it like a phantom limb that so many of us still feel. The web itself is constructed out of the shards of memory, some very beautiful, many painful, and the existence of the limb is the loss, the absence, the silence, the gaps in story, the stories that are not told because it was too painful, or there are no words, or there was no one to speak them to. At the same time that it's deeply personal to you, the story is so deeply personal to so many of us. And I think it works similar to the act of saying Kaddish or Yizkor, but it extends this sanctification so that amongst the grief, there is also a celebration of life. We are indeed still here. I can't believe that time has run out, but I want to remind everyone also that the interview has been recorded for all of you who came in late, or for those of you who just want to watch it again. I'm going to want to watch it again. And also I really urge you to read this outstanding book. And I'll make a plug for a local independent bookstore, Avenue Booksellers, which are holding copies of your book, but of course you can do so anywhere. I will not dictate. And Esther, it has been so wonderful to meet you and have this conversation.
Thank you for everything that you put into this conversation. And I look forward to coming to Melbourne, and I'm happy to sign each and every one of the books next year.
Good. And a Shabbat dinner, you know, you're welcome.
Thank you, Tali. I'd like everyone to maybe reveal themselves and turn on their videos if they'd like. And thank Tali for your wonderful efforts to make this conversation so engaging. You're an expert interviewer with a great way of drawing out insights from authors that extends the experience for readers, or for those who haven't read it, will certainly be rushing down out to buy a copy of this book right now. We really appreciate your efforts, Tali. A lot's gone into that, and as do the audience who've expressed their appreciation in the chat facility. So big round of applause. And thanks to the 120 plus attendees who've joined us this morning to learn about the real story behind the fascinating Everything is Illuminated book and film. Behind it is such a rich and layered story that so many of us descendants and others can relate to, whether we've made the journey to Europe in search of our vanished stories in those kind of barren landscapes, or if we've just been surfing the internet at home. And everyone, whether you're a Holocaust descendant or not, live in some ways in shadows from the past, and that's really the core of this book that you've written. So thank you, Esther, for writing the book and for joining us on a Saturday night where you are and a Sunday morning here and sharing your insights with us. The especially poignant for me was when you answered Tali's question with a question, which is a very Jewish trait. Tali asked how you overcame your mother's saying enough when you desperately wanted to know more. And in response, you said, how do you maneuver around the silence when you don't want to hurt your parents? And that's a sentiment that resonates with so many of the people who are watching this today. And so we look forward to meeting you in Melbourne one day, hopefully showing you around our new museum. And good luck to you and your museum project in Washington, the Capital Jewish Museum. Thanks again to Michelle. Hope to see you again soon. So on behalf of everyone at the Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, we wish everyone well in these challenging times. Our thoughts are with everyone, and especially with the Holocaust survivors. So just want to make a plug to go to our website, jhc.org.au. And we have a thing called Survivor Connect, and we're asking people to send letters and messages to the Holocaust survivors who've been volunteers with us, who are kind of missing that engagement. And Holocaust survivors, not just with us, others in your community, make sure that you're doing whatever you can to support them right now. It's challenging for us, but it's just another level of challenging for survivors. And while you're there, check out our virtual museum, because we've closed our doors temporarily, but you can go in a virtual world and visit our museum and see updates on our museum redevelopment. So let's hope we can gather together under one roof soon. Shalom, everyone, and thanks for joining us.